Welcome to Deadline, a discussion and critique by some of Washington's most seasoned journalists and pundits on how the media has been covering the week's news events without all the shouting you hear on those other news programs. I'm your host, Wayne Madsen. Joining me this week on our panel is Frank Anderson with the Middle East Policy Council, Paul Gallagher with E.I.R, and we have on Skype from Cairo, Sharif Youssef with the New Republic Group. Now, this week what we're seeing is the Egyptian election, renewed rebellion on Tahrir Square, and at least from the earliest returns, a victory for the Islamist parties in the Egyptian election, notably the Muslim Brotherhood, but also a strong showing by a more conservative Islamist group. And that's what I want to discuss with our panel. And I want to go to you, Frank, and ask you first, how do you see the Egyptian scenario playing out? We saw a great deal of hope expressed for the Arab Spring, of course, and now that the people have had their say, there's been an election. We see the Muslim Brotherhood doing very well in the election, but also a more conservative group representing what some people would argue is a more extreme form of religious belief from an Islamic perspective, doing also quite well. The pro-liberal democratic forces not doing as well as expected. How do you think this is going to play out with the new Egyptian government and Egypt's relations with the United States and some of its other neighbors?
First, it's no great surprise. Egyptian society is essentially conservative. It's one that has endured without really a revolution since Pharaonic times. There have been foreign occupations, there have been military coups, but the society is really not only is the wrong word, but it is evolved rather than having been really shaken up for millennia. So the idea that political parties that are based on or more in line with a conservative culture would succeed in an election is no great surprise. The other thing is no great surprise is that this is an economically challenged society and one in which the Muslim Brotherhood social programs have provided support that wouldn't otherwise be available from the market or from, frankly, a very inefficient government structure. So I'm not greatly surprised. Now, as to the question of how it's going to play out, I was impressed by how quickly the new concentration of protesters on Tahrir Square evaporated after the election turnout. I think that the Egyptian people are now into a participate and wait and see stage. The government, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, is also probably in a participate and wait and see mode. One of the more interesting things that came up was the government announcement of a significant drop in foreign currency reserves because the revolution in Egypt has disrupted the tourism industry, on which a significant chunk of the population depends for its livelihood. And the government's going to be able to make a very strong case that it's time to go back to business rather than to disruption. How Washington is going to handle this is another question. In Washington, it's not easy to avoid being shouted down if you point out that there are nuances in Islamic political groups. You'll recall that the Director of National Intelligence was soundly chastised for suggesting that maybe the Muslim Brotherhood had moderated. And if for no other reason than religious parties always do better in opposition than they do in power, I think it wouldn't be a surprise to see them moderate. And the question is going to be how the American political system is going to allow our administration to deal with that.
Right. Let's jump over to, since we're on the subject of Egypt, and I want to get to you, Paul, but let's jump over to Cairo, Shafiq, and I want to ask you from your perspective there, what are the people on the ground in Egypt saying about the first results of the election? Is there a fear that the incoming government could be much more sectarian than many of the people in Tahrir Square had expected?
Let me point out a couple of things. I would, yes, there is a large amount of disappointment. It depends, of course, who you ask. You said the street. If you ask the average person, I would say that much of the vote was a sympathetic vote. If you ask the revolutionaries, which are their own group, yes, there is a disappointment. However, that disappointment is turning into not just a challenge, but it's turning into opening the way for a third way. At this point, you have two competing views. You had the military state, or the security state, represented by the SCAF and represented by the Ministry of Interior, and the former remnants of the NDP on one end, and then on the other end you have the state that is run by the clergy or the theologians, in a sense reminiscent of what you have in Iran or possibly Saudi Arabia. However, the revolutionaries are pointing to a third way, which is a civil state, or a quasi-civil state, not really a civil state, as the way forward. It's represented by the Egyptian Bloc, by the Revolution Continues coalition, but it's more importantly represented by the revolutionaries. And I think it's very important in a time like this that we look at the process, the fact that this came about through a revolution. Once you have a revolution, you have what sociologists distinguish between agency and structure. There's quite a bit of agency that is taking place. You had in the revolution veiled women, very religious women, religious men who are at one point working with secular-minded other revolutionaries. That has in itself changed the balance, changed the dynamics, and changed the structure. You had many of the Muslim Brotherhood getting defections from within their ranks just during this past week because of what they see as Muslim Brotherhood failing to join their brothers in continuing the revolution. Now, I think that much of since you asked about what the press covers and doesn't cover, much of the press coverage in the West is focused on the elections and the results of the elections, while ignoring the fact that there is a revolutionary continuum. I think that Jan 25th will be a huge day. I think the movement is against SCAF, but also for a moderate state. It refuses very strongly a religious state. I think that when we speak of revolutions, revolutions are not by nature democratic. They can bring about democracy, but there is a time where they set the guidelines for the new order, for the new system. And I think that will be playing out very, very clearly in the next few months.
Right. And Paul, as from your perspective, we also saw the rating agency, one of the rating agencies was talking about the Egyptian bond rating, and similar to what happened in Greece and Italy and other countries. To what extent is the political situation in Greece in Egypt being driven by the situation with the economy and this whole Mediterranean problem with the failing economy seems certainly what happened in Tunisia and Egypt had an economic factor as well in getting the people out in the street to overthrow the regimes there. Do you see the economic situation being tied very tightly with the political situation in Egypt?
Well, this is, of course, only from secondhand knowledge, but going back over quite a number of years, Egypt is certainly one of the anchor economies of Africa, and this is an African continent in which desperately needed investment in modern infrastructure in particular has simply not occurred over decades and decades, with, in many places, disastrous results. And Egypt, I certainly think that Sharif must be right, that the future development of the political upheaval there is still very open, and still shows the potential for very good developments. But Egypt has been clearly for decades one of the most gripped countries by IMF limitations on policy, and has really been made to export food, I think above all to grow cotton and export that. It has really been driven away from serious investment in the productivity of the economy and towards meeting debts with exports. Now it has this revolution in a world situation where, first of all, it clearly was triggered in part by hyperinflation in food prices, which hit Egypt very hard and many other countries very hard. And now the lack of the United States and European countries coming to the fore with any kind of real investment aid to get a new government, however it is going to be formed and constituted, to enable it to improve the life of the Egyptians. They need transportation connections through the Mideast and further than that. You can go all the way back to the Lagos Plan of Action, 1981, which was a very ambitious idea of power, additional power for Egypt, additional places where the population could move to because of additional water management solutions there, and also of transport. And this is long postponed. Certainly the Mubarak government went very, very far away from any such idea. So
I also want to bring up what's going on in some of the other countries in the region where there have been elections also. Tunisia, where the Islamist party scored a big win, have now formed the government there. Morocco, which had an election under a new changes to the constitution where the king gave up some of his power. He still had some power, but the party that won in Morocco was also the party that represents more traditional Islamist values. What we're seeing happening in Syria, we don't really know what's going to happen as a result of that situation, but certainly there's all sorts of factions that play there. But the big question is, and also I should mention Libya, where again there's a new government. There's a strong Islamist faction, but then there's more secular factions at play. The idea being that in Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, maybe in Libya, the idea that what we're going to see is Muslim parties, Islamic parties that are more like Turkey's, with a commitment to democracy. Where do you see this going, Frank? Is it going to be the Turkey model, or could it be the Iran or Saudi Arabia model?
Well, certainly not the Iran model. In terms of the Saudi Arabia model, there's probably no society on the face of the earth that's changed more in the recent past in Saudi Arabia. So I'm not certain what the Saudi Arabia model is, other than one of revolution from the top, which is an unusual paradigm, and a country that's really engaged in a civil war in order to prevent the takeover. Was never a threat, but to deal with the threat of what we fear from Islamist parties, which is violent jihadists. In Islam, it's called takfiris, people who are able to declare that others are not really Muslims, and therefore subject them to violence. Now, in terms of Morocco and Tunisia, now Morocco certainly hasn't undergone the upheaval that Tunisia has, but you had a place with a more functional government. The Tunisian government had drifted away from a decent output for its people in terms of protecting and serving the population into really kleptocracy. And with the spark that set that off, not so much a revolution than a popular uprising that forced a change of administration. And that change of administration election has now been won by a party that is, to call it Islamist would be to sort of say that the Christian Democrat parties in Europe are somehow akin to fundamentalist religious movements.
These are Merkel would probably take exception to that charge. Yeah,
well,
for one, right?
These are societies that are conservative. They're cultures that are religiously centered. It's religion that is the mechanism by which families transfer values to the next generation. It's the mechanism by which every institution of society derives its legitimacy. In Morocco, the king is still commander of the faithful. The symbol for every military unit is a trinity. That the top is for God, this right hand is for the nation, and the left hand is for the king. And it's in this context that Morocco, I think, is, like Tunisia, moving cautiously forward toward reform rather than an upheaval. And I certainly don't see either of those populations drifting into some kind of support for a Takfiri ideology or violent jihad against the rest of the world.
Right. Right. Let's hop back to Cairo. From your vantage point in Cairo, we've heard a lot of talk about the Turkey model. Certainly Prime Minister Erdogan has been briefing President Obama on a lot of the developments in the Middle East. He's a very key player in what's going on in Syria. He's also, of course, has been keeping the White House apprised of the situation in Egypt and some of the other countries, Libya too. From your sense in Cairo, with the Muslim Brotherhood, are they getting their talking points as far as what they're telling the Western media using the Turkish model, or are they going to come up with a uniquely Egyptian model and forgetting any sort of connections to the situation in Turkey with the AK party there, which has been said, some people say it's got Islamist tendencies, although, again, it's probably no more Islamist than the Christian Democratic parties in Germany and other European nations are in any way connected to the Catholic Church, for example.
Well, let me say a couple of things. First, if we had assumed, or if these revolutions were Islamic revolutions taking over the secular or quasi-secular states in the region, this would be reason for alarm, as what has happened in Iran. But these revolutions did not come about to set up Islamic states, nor did they come out to set up secular states. These uprisings, they're not really yet revolutions, they're revolutions in process. These uprisings were for freedom, they were for social justice, and they were for dignity. And slogans, various, similar slogans. That process, that revolutionary process, will not simply yield to an Islamic theocracy in any of these countries. If it does, at some point, it'll most certainly be challenged. On Jan 25th in Egypt, no one mentioned an Islamic state. On Jan 28th, no one mentioned an Islamic state. They were for freedom, they were against Mubarak and Mubarakism. Now, you mentioned the Turkish model. Well, it goes back to what you mean by the Turkish model. Is it the Ataturkian model? The Ataturkian model is simply some kind of quasi-democracy with under the aegis of the military to protect the secularism of the state. Now, that has certainly been almost offered by the SCAF in Egypt. It has been rejected by the revolutionaries. They do not accept the military rule. In fact, the revolution was against military rule in many, many respects, even though that we embraced the army. We embraced the armies as protectors of the revolution initially, not as guarantors of the old system. Of course, things have turned out differently, and very, very quickly, the revolutionary forces have mobilized against the military junta. Now, on the other hand, you have the religious forces that have been in the society for years. I'm thinking 40 years or 50 years that these organizations have been doing plenty of social work. There was a vacuum of civil society. The civil society was largely repressed. However, one pillar that the regimes could not suppress was religion. Therefore, it has come out stronger. However, as I said, it is not a force that will not be challenged. It is already being challenged. There's already plenty of fear mongering going on, and I think many of the people that voted out of sympathy for these parties will, one, take sides with the revolutionary forces once again. Two, they will also not vote for them in coming elections. There was another a gentleman that discussed the economy. Let me make it clear that the SCAF has waged a counter-revolution against revolutionary forces, and that has taken the following form. First, there has been what I call regime-engineered violence and regime-manufactured security. The elections were eerily secure. Two, the sectarian divisions that are created, they're false. They're state perpetrated. Three, it's the fear mongering with the Islamic State, and it has worked and it continues to work. Theocracy. Four, it's the economy. It's intentionally mismanaging the economy. If we look at the economy, there is much that we could have done. We could have gotten most of our foreign debt canceled if we had done the proper roadshow, if we had marketed the issue with Western countries, at least foreign debt. We could have received much of the capital that is simply that has left the country. Again, had we done the proper paperwork, that has been refused. Regarding the foreign reserves, there's much that could have been done to stimulate the local economy through infrastructure, through providing funds to small and medium-sized enterprises. The economy has been mismanaged, and there's a strong suspicion that mismanagement is intentional.
Well, yeah.
If I could just say,
yeah, go ahead.
I think he's put his finger on something important to the economy, which is that Egypt, the Egyptian, the Mubarak, and before that, the Egyptian military regime was playing a very important, from the standpoint of Britain, the United States, and so on, NATO, fixed strategic relationship to Israel and to the question of Palestine and the rest of the development of the rest of the Middle East. And that, I think, was part of what put Egypt in a kind of a straitjacket in terms of economic development. It was really, it had become an extremely important chess piece in terms of keeping the policy which has come out of London and so forth over that long period of time. And so it was not given a choice, or would have had to fight for a choice of the kind of economic policy that he's talking about, the kind of real investment that he's talking about.
Right, right. Yeah, it's funny. I'm glad you brought up. You mentioned Israel, and that is a key factor here. We had Prime Minister Netanyahu, of course, coming out this past week and saying look, I don't think maybe this idea, this Arab Spring, is all that much of a liberal thing. He pointed to some of these parties that are winning. I suppose he was thinking more of Egypt than maybe in Tunisia, but definitely what Netanyahu had to say was that he feels that Israel is somehow threatened by the rise of certain political parties. And we saw what happened with the Palestinians taking their case before the United Nations, where the Israeli lobby here in Washington weighed in heavily with Congress, especially the House of Representatives, and wanted to voted to cut off assistance to the Palestinians, to suspend U.S. Contributions to UNESCO, which accepted Palestine as a full member. Do we see the risk here that if the government that's formed in Egypt is not to the liking of Israel and hence not to the liking of its lobby here in Washington, that we could see a cutoff by Congress of aid to Egypt? And how would that affect this long-standing relationship the United States has had providing military aid to Egypt and Israel to keep some sort of a balance? I'll ask you first, Frank, and then we'll go around the table.
Actually, you bring up what I think is an important thing about this wave of, I don't know what to call it, revolutions, or political change. Two things are absent from the narrative. One is Palestine. You know, it's not, in each of these places, the uprisings, revolutions, whatever we're going to call it, these phenomena have been national and local. You know, the two narratives that have dominated Middle Eastern politics for much of the 20th century, or the last half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, which were the struggle against what European imperialism and its remnants and the effect on those societies, and the Palestine question. It's sometimes mentioned in Egypt. This is not a revolution because they were unhappy about the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. I can't imagine that that's going to be a high priority for any new Egyptian government. Morocco and Tunisia were never major factors in the Arab-Israeli struggle. Syria could be, in the sense that one of the things one learned 40 years ago when one went to the Middle East to study was that you cannot make war in the Middle East without Egypt. And you cannot make peace without Syria. I frankly accept definitely the first, and definitely the first when we think of war in 20th century concepts of moving armies, conquering territory. That certainly couldn't be done without Egypt. And when Egypt was taken out of the strategic question, that profoundly changed the relationship between Israel and the rest of the Arab world. Syria has never abandoned its position as the last opponent to Israel, and frankly, the cost for the Syrian people of concentrating on that, or allowing a government to use that as an excuse to stay in power when it was failing to serve and protect its people, has not been serious. But I don't believe that what's happening around the Arab world is seriously challenging the safety of Israel. Mm-hmm. It could very easily challenge the legitimacy of the greater Israel project and the settlements project, the ability to claim that it's necessary to hold on to the West Bank and Gaza to protect Israel from the marauding armies of its neighbors is, I believe, going to be greatly diminished in the near future. I don't believe these governments are going to concentrate on Israel or allow that to be an issue to arise between them and the United States.
And Shafiq, in Cairo, to what extent is Netanyahu's comments that he obviously doesn't like what's transpiring in Egypt? He has definite opinions about where this Arab awakening is heading for his own political purposes. Is the Egyptian-Israeli dynamic any sort of an issue in Egypt, or is there's some line of thought that the Muslim Brotherhood may weigh in heavily to support the Hamas government in Gaza, and we now see that the Fatah and Hamas have come to some sort of an arrangement, and there's even talk of Hamas recognizing Israel. But to what extent does this, because I think one of the problems here in the United States is the press, when it talks about Egypt, the Israeli factor is often played up, and maybe not justifiably so. Maybe it's not an issue. But where do you see this from your vantage point in Cairo?
Well, let's be clear. Israel, like it or not, is a state based on religious groups from around various different geographic locations. The fact that Israel exists as a religious-based country has actually fueled the development of Islamic forces around the region. Now, that being said, a right-wing government like that of Netanyahu is certainly helped by the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, the rise of Hamas. If we suddenly had secular-minded governments and secular and very democratic uprisings around the Arab world, this would certainly make Israel look singled out. Like it's this, I don't want to say theocracy. Israel is not a theocracy, but it's a religious-based state. In non-religious-based states, in fact, Egypt has always had Jews, as far as Judaism has existed almost. There's some Jews around in Egypt today. If Egypt becomes this very liberal place, which actually allows for various citizens, just like the U.S. has Jews, that it suddenly starts to actually put a question on the legitimacy of the existence of Israel as a religious state. And you start to have these questions. And of course, you have this issue now it's threatening Netanyahu now, where he wants recognition as Israel as the land of the Jewish people. And so you start to have this question once again of the Jewish people, and it's very, very defensive. What do you mean by the Jewish people? Can you say the Muslim people or the Christian people? Or of course, some of the Islamic parties are saying the same rhetoric, and so I think they feed each other off very, very well. They help each other off very, very well. Now, as far as the U.S. is concerned, and of course, it's very clear. You have this domestic politics interfering with international politics, often against the interests of the United States. The interests of the United States in this region are obviously the oil. There is a deep belief that the Muslim peoples cannot be as trusted as the government of Israel. I think that's a belief that should be put into question. General Petraeus has put this into question. Going to how the Egyptians see this, the Egyptians have see that there has been a remarkable number of years where there has been an injustice, and that injustice has been largely, or partly at least, the responsibility of their corrupt leadership. So this revolution is going to have an element in foreign policy. Now, will that mean Israel is threatened? I think, as the gentleman has pointed out, I think certainly the greater Israel is threatened. The way the settlements are going, if this continues, then the very existence of Israel is actually put into question, because I don't think that's very sustainable. That's what many Israelis are starting to say now, and many pundits as well.
Well, we've been talking about the situation in Egypt and the larger Arab world, but we also have what's happening in Europe. It looks like we're seeing an absolute meltdown of the Eurozone. The great idea was to establish a federal states of Europe. It started out with the old European coal and steel community, a European economic community, to the European Union. And now it looks like maybe the European Union either expanded too rapidly and it's imploding because it tried to do too much too fast. We've got the largest general strike by the public sector in Britain in a generation or more. We now have non-elected prime ministers governing Greece and Italy. Berlusconi thrown out in Italy, Papandreou thrown out in Greece. These are prime ministers who have been sanctioned by the bankers, the European central bankers. Many people questioning this. We saw the socialists ousted in the Spanish election. There's a real change going on. People in Europe demanding to be heard when they feel that they're not being heard. And here in the United States, of course, with the Occupy Wall Street movement, we've had police go in and evict people from various cities. Now it looks like the mayors have at least coordinated some of these activities. Maybe there's some thought that some of this was coordinated from here in Washington by the Homeland Security Department. I just want to get your feeling on, especially in the Mediterranean area and other countries in Europe, but also now in the United States, this feeling of economic angst, people just feel that they're politically not being heard, their voices aren't being heard. Frank, I want to ask you first, some people say, yes, what happened in the Arab world actually came to Europe and the United States. Do you see that there's any sort of commonality here, or is it just because of the economic and political situations unique to each area?
I do think they're unique, and as having spent my adult life paying attention to the Middle East, I'm really almost afraid to talk about this subject, but I get most of my wisdom on it from my eldest son. And I see a parallel between something happening in the United States and what has happened in Europe. My son's a lot more conservative than I am, but loves to quote a line from de Tocqueville that the American democratic experiment will succeed until the Congress learns that it can bribe the people with their own money. And in a process, and this is my oversimplification, of decades of bribing the people with their own money and driving up debt, we've put ourselves in an economic box that I don't understand well enough to propose a solution. The Eurozone is threatened by the prospect that the Greek parliament can bribe its people with the Germans' money. And that seems to me a difficult thing to sustain over some time. I believe that the fundamental institutions of Europe and the United States are strong enough that we will probably figure out a way out of this at some time in the next few years. But it's going to have to be one in which there is substantially less support for individuals in a period when other parts of the world have figured out how to outproduce us and therefore beat us in the economic game.
Right. Paul, do you see this, what's going on in Europe, Middle East, and here in this country, and Canada too, with people out in the street demanding to be heard? Do you see this as some sort of a global issue, or are you convinced that it's also each situation is different and they just happen to be going on at the same time, but they're in no way are there any connections between these various popular uprisings?
I think it's definitely global. We're heading into the 5th year of a severe international banking crisis, which has not gotten any better. In fact, what the central banks did 3 days ago, which got all the applause from the markets, that sudden burst of money printing by the Fed, above all, took us directly back into November 2008, when the same thing was done by in fact, ironically, that coordinated liquidity binge was done a day after Bloomberg News here in the U.S. had just exposed the dimensions of the one in November and December of 2008, which at one point involved $1.2 trillion in emergency liquidity loans to banks in one day, December 8th of 2008. And as we were mentioning before, at that time the market went up 6%. This time it only went up 4% in response. There has been no change, nothing to cure that banking crisis in that time. It has simply ground down the economy, most of the economies of the world, with some clear exceptions in Asia, most of the economies of the world. So I think it then clearly was the case that the uprisings in the Arab countries and in North Africa, not because conditions were the same, but because of this global crash and the way people were angry about it, there were immediate reactions to it. I remember clearly there were signs, we are Egyptians, we are all Egyptians, in the Wisconsin protests against the Governor Walker's doing away with collective bargaining in Wisconsin. In Ohio, in the same period when the trade unions, they were carrying signs identifying themselves as Egyptians. Clearly, it wasn't the same circumstance exactly or even approximately, but the trigger came of those actions in North Africa, in the North African countries. The trigger came into an ongoing worsening banking collapse. And as far as the euro is concerned, the euro is not the solution. And you know, we were going to discuss the way the press is covered. It's universally covered as a disaster should the euro collapse. Should the euro collapse. The euro is the problem, not the solution. The euro was initially an attempt to put a straitjacket on Germany and its ability to invest by inflating it and by putting it under the clamp of a limitation on budgets and a limitation on investment. It definitely had that effect on Germany. It has since had that effect on every single one of these countries. And as you mentioned, it has now gone to outright appointment of what are in effect dictators in Greece and potentially in Italy. And these people are just taking hatchets to the economies of those countries. And that's far more serious than what the fate of the euro as a currency is. All of those countries' economies are now contracting. Some of them are contracting very rapidly in Europe. That's making the debt crisis worse. It's also leading to a tremendous imbalance between this economic contraction in the transatlantic world and continued expansion in major countries in Asia. And tensions are rising, and the president certainly did his best when he was in Asia recently to hype up those tensions and to attack China and to appear to be threatening China with military consequences. This, I think, is coming out of this United States-European transatlantic 5-year banking crisis and collapse where nothing has been done to right it.
Right. From your vantage point in Cairo, I mean, we've seen the scenes of the police firing tear gas into the crowds on Tahrir Square. Is the press in Egypt covering what's going on in many of the American cities where we've seen police indiscriminately use pepper spray on students out at the University of California at Davis? We've seen. Are they also seeing the scenes of tear gas being used in places like Oakland? Police clubbing people, shooting demonstrators, including some military veterans. In one case, one in Oakland was hit with a canister in his head and was severely injured. So my question is, are the people in Egypt seeing these scenes, and how are they reacting to what's happening right here in the United States? Do they have some sympathy for what has always been considered a beacon of democracy, but certainly questions might be asked now about what people are seeing here in the United States.
Well, I think on the level of activists, yes, activists are very, very aware of what's happening in the States, and they do see some linkages. They do see the fact that there is a failure of parliamentary democracy to deliver the needs and desires of the people. At the same time, if you look at the state media and what the state media is showing and what people are actually concerned about, no, you really don't see that that very, very clearly. However, when comparisons are made to Egypt, it does filter down, and I think Egyptians are very, very amused and they're very curious. However, local events are so tumultuous that I don't think there is the ability to grasp all of that and to assimilate all of those linkages. The priority is getting rid of SCAF and putting together a new order.
Right. You brought up what's going on. We had President Obama attend the APEC conference in Hawaii, hosting it actually, and then attending the East Asian Forum in Bali. And we have seen the ratcheting up of tensions now with China, and also to some degree Russia with the missile shield. Russians are saying, wait a minute, we feel that is directed against us, and now we may see some confrontation between the Russian Navy and the U.S. Navy in the Mediterranean. This goes, I mean, these are like headlines from the early 70s or the late 60s from the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli War of 67 and the one of 73. But as far as what we could say is these superpower confrontations, and maybe Russia and China aren't like the superpower we once saw with the Soviet Union, but definitely they're still powers to be reckoned with. Hillary Clinton going to Burma, Myanmar, which has always been considered a Chinese, in the Chinese sphere of influence. We've seen U.S. High-ranking military officers go to Vietnam, Philippines, talking about protecting their rights to the South China Sea. Are we on the verge maybe of a renewed... I would also throw in here that the former head of Mossad, Meir Dagan, said any Israeli attack on Iran would result in a regional war. So we're hearing more and more about regional war, superpower conflict. Are we going back to the future here? I'll start with you first, Paul.
I think that President Obama is going back to the future, and that London is definitely, the Cameron government, London is definitely going back to the future. Since the Netanyahu's desire, apparently, to prepare an attack on Iran, since that became public, because the debate broke out. You mentioned Dagan, who said that he thought that the settlers, the ideology of the settlers in Israel was a bigger threat to Israel than
I think Bill Clinton even said something along the same lines not long ago.
But since it broke out around that, these generals, former generals, United States General Hoare, General Johns, General Zinni, have gone to the public and said, we face a danger of general war here. From what we have been told, they've also gone to the president and said, stop the Israelis, and they got a cold shoulder from him. And then with his trip to Asia, he has really escalated this very, very dramatically by seeming to posture in confrontation with China at every possible opportunity, while at the same time bringing in Marines, bringing in submarines, and so forth to Australia. But it was provocative, intentionally provocative, and clearly this is his behavior at the beginning of the election campaign is also coming out of the extreme situation the U.S. economy is in.
And now we see a real breakdown in U.S.-Pakistani relations with the attack by NATO on Pakistani military, 25 killed. And Pakistan is a nuclear-armed country. They always said, well, if you have nuclear arms, that would be your insurance policy against being attacked by another nuclear power. Well, it's happened. And if you just want to finish that thought, and I want to ask you too, Frank, about where we're heading with these regional power confrontations, if you had some.
Well, if you listen to the president of Russia, Medvedev, and the chief of staff, General Makarov, and many other statements coming out, they are talking openly of the possibility of even nuclear confrontation. They have made naval deployments. They're making very aggressive statements about the radar sites in Europe, about taking them out. And I'm talking about the president of Russia, not a blogger somewhere. Again, though, I think that the basis of this is that there is a reaction coming from some countries in the United States and Europe, particularly from the Obama administration, from London, a reaction to this real economic collapse and 4.5-year banking crisis in the West compared to, they haven't been unaffected, but they've continued to grow, the major Asian economies. And we're getting, as a result, a threat of a major power confrontation between the United States and Europe on one side and Asian powers on the other. The Russians, for Russian reasons, are being very outspoken, whereas the Chinese are being much less so, but that's the character of the situation.
Right. And Frank, you saw the superpower confrontation from the inside of the government during the Cold War. Do you see this as maybe a little bit more dangerous because there are more regional players who are not really beholden to Moscow or, as it was in the Cold War, Beijing to some extent, but not a whole lot? Is this more of a dangerous situation in your estimation?
I tend not to worry about cataclysms, but I'll point out the following, and that is that we, the United States and our allies, did a pretty good job of managing the last half of the 20th century. Well, a little more than the last half, but we eliminated National Socialism and scientific socialism as a threat to world well-being. We kept out of war. Despite the fact, in the Middle East, there was a great book written by a former boss of mine as an ambassador, not in the CIA, Richard Parker, called The Politics of Miscalculation in the Middle East, in which he went through the 1948, 1956, and 1973 wars, in which every concerned player was miscalculating. They misunderstood the intelligence, they misunderstood the likely actions of the other players in the game, and it brought about some very dangerous moments. 1956 risked the breakup of the American, French, British alliances. 1973 brought us closer to the brink with the Soviet Union than any event other than the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nevertheless, we got through it because we were concentrating on the big stuff and we didn't make as many huge errors. The list of miscalculations and strategic blunders that the United States has made in the 21st century is disturbing. We reacted in fear and anger to 9/11 and wasted what was a world of sympathy and desire to cooperate with us following it by deciding to go to war in Iraq in a way in which our list of miscalculations was endless. We invaded a country with a force that was only sufficient to punish it, not to conquer it and occupy it and control it. And we're just now winding down with the consequences of that. Almost don't have time to say it, but it was a great image from a friend of mine, Milt Bearden, who in early 2000 2004 said, or middle of 2003, it's just like you were in town with everybody. Every town had a crazy kid. And you're in the car with this crazy kid who's driving past all the signs that say bridge out. And his speed is increasing. And you're pleading with him to look at the signs. Nevertheless, he crashes through the last barrier, and this automobile is in the sky, about to go down 200 feet into a cavern, and he turns and says, "How can I fix this now?" We took what was an initially very successful punitive raid into Afghanistan that it should have been, and turned it into a now decades-old struggle to fix problems that no one's ever been able to fix in South Asia. In the process, we forced, initially with very good diplomacy, pulled the Pakistani leadership into an alliance with us, but then refused to recognize that they have interests too over time, and we've alienated them. I don't know who dreamed up the idea that when we need the Pakistanis as, if nothing else, a logistics channel, that we should suggest that a seat on the Security Council for India was just the kind of thing that the President of the United States should encourage. Mm-hmm. When we rely upon the Russians for the alternate logistics path, that we thought that maybe ignoring Russian interests was a good idea. And now we're confronted with a nation that says, we might cut off 40% of your supplies to Afghanistan, and another that says we might cut off the other 60. Right. And a population inside Afghanistan that says we might not authorize you to stay.
Right. I want to jump over before we've only got a few minutes left to Cairo. To what extent are you concerned that if there is, say, an outbreak of regional hostilities, you're all trying to get rid of the military-imposed military government over there, but in a situation where a regional war could break out, they would of course come back and say, well, now is not the time for us to give up any sort of our powers, and we need to stay in charge. Is there a fear that what's happening outside of Egypt could affect what's happening internally?
I fear so. I fear that much of what we call the counter-revolution is actually driven from outside Egypt, from places like Saudi Arabia and, of course, Israel, and, of course, the United States. The United States is the ally of SCAF. I think it's very fearsome that if you do get, I want to say, not necessarily secular or religious government, but an independent Egyptian government, that is the U.S. and Israel's greatest fear. And you might get maneuvers to downplay that possibility. I think, yes, it's only until we have civilian supremacy that this revolution will be really successful. And I think a regional war would certainly delay that. And so I wouldn't be surprised if any of this happens on the scene, partly because of what is going on around the region, not just in Egypt.
Okay, well, I think that will sum it up for this week, and I want to thank our panel in studio for joining us for this week's deadline, and Sharif Yusuf joining us via Skype from Cairo. And thank you again, and we will be back next week with another edition of Deadline, and please join us again. I'm your host, Wayne Madsen.